All right, looks like we're live. I didn't add an intro. So let me just hit play here. Ladies and gentlemen, Gad Barnea is joining us. Dr. Gad Barnea, welcome back to Myth Vision.
Always a pleasure to be here with you.
Hey, I thought the intro was going to play. I'm sitting here pausing going, what's going on? Let's just play the intro, let people join in, and let's have some fun.
Fantastic.
Welcome to Myth Vision Podcast. I'm your host, Derek Lambert. I have Dr. Gad Barnea joining us today. Gad, you look wonderful, man. My audio is being stupid, so I can't hear you. It's you. Hold on, let me unmute you. Can't unmute your guest. Says you're muted. Am I muted or is he muted, ladies and gentlemen?
I was muted. Which is weird because we just talked before this and it was not muted. So somehow it automatically muted me, but yeah, whatever.
It's the other powers that be. It must be. Dualism must be true.
It's a spiritual thing. Spiritual mute. But that was an epic intro. Bravo.
Thank you. Thank you. Impressive. Yeah, I thought, we love touching just all humanity, you know what I mean? Yeah. And it's not exclusive to Bible because we'd like to do much more than that. I'm trying to expand. And, that brings us to our topic today because, I like to start where I come from. A lot of people go, why do you always do critical stuff on Christianity? It's like, I was a Christian, so that makes sense. Occasionally I dabble on other stuff, but then I contacted you, Dr. Barnea, and you said, hey, listen, I've got something coming up I'm going to be doing a lecture on. I'd like to discuss with you. And it is dealing with ultimately the origin of what we would say God as monotheistic, if I'm not mistaken. But we have to define our terms and get into the weeds. So I ask everybody who's watching to stay tuned. If you're interested in getting his book, it's free. Download the PDF right here, the EPUB right here. It's in the comment section, pinned. So Yahwism under the Achaemenid Empire. And I hope people will go check that out. They can download the book for free. You can also get the hardcover if you really want to for $141, but you could just read it on your computer and your phone if you can afford that. So anyway, Gad, help us understand, what have you come across that's made your wheels turn, you know?
Well, I mean, obviously the question of monotheism is at the core of not just the biblical studies, but really any scholarship, any study of religion anywhere in humanity. So it doesn't matter if it's even in the ancient Near East. I wanted to say ancient Near East, but looks like the image is a little off.
It'll probably catch up.
Okay, but so, you know, if we talk about religion, if we talk about any kind of cultic practice, monotheism is a question that's going to be at the center of the discussion. And so it is really important to define our terms and define what we mean by this, and to trace the history of this phenomenon, which is a very unnatural phenomenon. We'll talk about this, but it is a very, very strange phenomenon in a sense to think about monotheism. And as I'm going to talk about in a little bit, monotheism is a very late development. And so it is it has become, over the past year or so, more and more of a focus of my research, and I'm kind of diving more and more into it, and lecturing. I had a lecture on this in Warsaw a couple of months ago, and now another one coming up. And I'm writing on this and doing more and more research and getting deeper and deeper into this incredibly interesting and important question. And again, we have a lot of misconceptions on monotheism. We throw this term around, but it's really something that we often misuse. And I'm talking even about scholars. I mean, in scholarship, and I have misused it myself as well. So we often do that, and it is, I think, time to define it more carefully now, and understand what is monotheism and also what's not monotheism as well. So so that's why I've been working on this and spending a lot of time thinking about this question and tracing what led to the development of the concept of monotheism. If we think about this historically, this process could have gone in different ways historically. It went in a certain way for a number of reasons that we'll talk about. But it's not, as I said, it's very unnatural. Monotheism is not a natural phenomenon. What is called polytheism, which is just recognizing the plurality of forces that affect our lives. I mean, basically, a god is basically the force that affects my life, right? A god is a power that can change my life, that can affect my life. And that's why people sacrifice to the deity, and people pray to the deity for help, because that's a power that the deity has. And that's why, initially, very simple societies from the beginning of humanity worshipped thunder and rain and sun and moon, because these are powers that you can see and that affect your life. They can affect, the agriculture. They can affect your cycles of plenty and famine. It's a tangible power that can affect your life, and really can decide if you live or die, in a sense. I mean, can affect life and death, questions of life and death. And so that is how religion basically developed, from recognizing forces that affect your life, and the plurality of these forces, and people trying to control these forces in different ways. Again, sacrifices and prayer and things like that. So that is very natural. That is very normal. That is very, you see a power and you assume that power can affect your life, and you try to manipulate that power in different ways. Very normal to see also a plurality of powers, and not seek any exclusivity for a particular power, or anything behind these powers that that is kind of the lowest common or the highest common denominator, if you will. So recognizing the plurality is very normal. That's the normal. That's kind of the natural, so to speak, way to think about the divinity. So the development, this further development of thinking about a unifying force that unifies, that kind of unites, and that is kind of behind all of these forces that you do feel and see, and unites them, or is somehow at their essence or at their substance. That is not normal. That is not, or that, at least not natural. I shouldn't use the word normal here, but it's not natural. That is a philosophical level. That is something beyond the natural realm. That is really that is now humanity thinking more deeply about this. Yeah, sure.
Just to make a kind of point, and tell me if you think I'm touching what you're saying correctly. That is, it's not intuitive from just average observers and how
Correct.
our experience in life seems to be. Someone had to really sit down and think hard about trying to conceptualize something like this. Whereas, again, if I'm an ancient person and I see other families who have other fathers and other mothers and other children, and they have their own ecosystems, and like everything in the world seems to have a level of plurality.
Right.
And
but also, I mean, also your next door village has a different god, right? Or your so I mean, it cannot be that it's the same god, right? It's a different name,
right?
So you have this the slide that I sent you on the degrees of assimilation, and I think that'll help the viewers, the listeners, understand, or the viewers in this case, because it's a slide. Understand, very simplified, very, very, very simplified. But there are different degrees of how to understand this plurality of forces, and you have what is called interpretatio, or translation or assimilation of deities, where only the names are different. Okay, so it's the same. It's basically the same. The people understand and accept. This is very, very typical of the so-called polytheistic world. And we're going to use definitions that are always problematic. The definition monotheism is problematic. We'll talk about that, but also polytheistic is not less problematic, but we'll use it because it's, that's what most people use. So we'll use it and we'll understand that it is problematic. But basically the underlying idea of polytheism is this interpretatio. Okay, and it has a very, very long history of saying, okay, Zeus is the same as Ahura Mazda, is the same as Yahweh, is the same as whatever other deity you want, Amun in Egypt or what have you. So interpretatio just means I interpret that deity, or I translate this deity as a different deity, but it's the same one. Okay, this idea had a very, very long life, and in parallel to the development of other ideas. So all of these 4 points that you're seeing here are not mutually exclusive. And in the development of these theological ideas, they existed side by side, and sometimes were professed, so to speak, in parallel to each other. So, for example, the idea of interpretatio appears also in the New Testament. Okay, this God is the same God. So, for example, in Acts chapter 17, when Paul is in Athens, he says about the unknown God, this is the God that I have come to proclaim to you, right? So it is the same God. It's an interpretatio.
Right.
It is what he's using, what he's saying, what he basically is following Paul, or whomever wrote this, put that in Paul's mouth. is that it is using classic interpretatio, this very, very old polytheistic trope. What you call X, we call Y. Okay, you find that also in the letter of Aristeas. You find there that the author of the letter says about the Jews, he says, what we call Zeus, they call Yahweh. It's the same one. So now we're talking about interpretatio, this very classic polytheistic concept, being used well into the first, really even the second century of the Common Era. Mm-hmm. Okay. So, and clearly other mechanisms of assimilation were already practiced at the same time. But interpretatio, this classic polytheistic concept, was still being practiced, still being observed, even by Paul or whomever wrote this and put that in Paul's mouth, and the letter of the pseudo Aristeas. So this is a concept that is very, very foundational in how people in antiquity, all the way well into the Common Era, perceived of the divine. And we see it in Macrobius in the 5th century of the Common Era. We see it, we see it for a very, very long time. Then you have the necessary link between this classic polytheistic view of the divinity and what is closer to what we would consider monotheistic today. And that is, the key is essentiality, so the essence. It means that the essence, not that this God, you call this God, I call him Zeus and you call him Ahura Mazda, etc. But that Zeus, Ahura Mazda, and Amun, etc., and Yahweh, they all share an essence. Okay, they have the divine essence. It's not that they are we give them a different name. But here we suddenly jump into bridging the one and the many, the one and the multiple, right? Mm-hmm. Because we are going to the essence. This idea is, as we're going to see, is really originally found in Indo-Iranian religions, and then of course, and all the way back to the second millennium before the current era. So very relatively ancient. And we find it, of course, later on in pre-Socratic philosophy and in Platonism and other important philosophical sources such as these. But the idea of essentiality is the bridge between the world of interpretatio, which continued alongside of this concept of essentiality. So interpretatio and essentiality, as I said, interpretatio continued well into the Common Era, so they continued side by side. Now, once you have this concept of essentiality, you can go into different ways of looking at monotheism. And one is all is one, and the other one is one is all. These are two different concepts of what can be thought of as monotheism. And all is one. We find it in Hinduism, of course, and we find it in Kabbalah, in the Jewish Kabbalah. We find it in Sufism, so in a branch of Islam called Sufism, in Wahadat al-Wujud, the unity of being, the unity of those that exist. And the flip side of it, or the what I would call actual monotheism, the only concept that actually merits the title monotheism. And by using the term merit, I don't mean qualitatively. I just mean as a from a definitional perspective. I'm not claiming that monotheism is superior to polytheism in any way. Okay, so just to be very clear. But from a moral perspective and the effects on society, I mean, that's another discussion for another day. Mm-hmm. But so there's no qualitative comment here. But saying one is all all, this is strict monotheism that is first found in Islam. Okay, so in the Tawheed, the idea of the Tawheed in Islam, which did not grow in a vacuum, of course, that came from centuries of discussions and disputes within the Christian community, mostly, thinking about how to reconcile the one and the multiple within the definition of the Trinity. And Islam, by rejecting those, came to the idea of the Tawheed, which is one of the pillars of Islam, and the first time that really strict monotheism was defined and followed. But as you can see here, we see in Sufism that it's already, which is a branch of Islam, it's already not really monotheism. And within Islam, there are different branches that can be defined as not strict monotheism. Just like in Judaism as well, as we see here in Kabbalah, which is really not very, Kabbalah is in many ways, almost borderline polytheistic as well. So these are the degrees, again, very, very, very simplified this kind of description of what these degrees of assimilations look like. But this can be used to continue the discussion.
You can see the linear kind of, I wouldn't say every case is linear, but like you can see how the transition and evolution would take place as humans went from just interpretation into interpretatio. Like, I've recently been digging into this, and right now I have a video coming out just to highlight that virgin birth, right? Everyone talks about the virgin birth, so unique. And I go, well, I can't find you a text that just says, and the young maiden was a virgin and God overshadowed her with his spirit and she gave birth. No, but I can find you actually in Herodotus where he talks about this god Apis, which is actually Apophis, the touched one, where Zeus in the beam of a light, or in other cases just touches her, no sexual union, touches the young maiden who's called a horned virgin. She's a cow.
Yeah.
She gives birth. Well, this Apis or Apophis also is Harpocrates, who, like you could see how Greeks are doing their interpretatio all throughout. Herodotus does it. Much later they do it. But the essentiality is also interesting too, where you find this almost syncretism of the deities as one, they're all one, leading to the all is one. And then the all is one just feels like one little flip trick. It's like all is one and then boom, one is all. You could see why that naturally evolves out of the prior model. Right.
Absolutely. So as I said, the bridge is essentiality. That's really where people started thinking about, okay, we have at some point in time, and as I said, probably somewhere to the east of Iran, somewhere in today's Afghanistan, Pakistan, somewhere there, people started thinking more about more philosophically and about going behind the scenes. So yes, we have this idea of a multiplicity of deities, but what if this one is many and many is one? I mean, how do we reconcile the two? So, for example, in the Rig Veda, which we can date pretty securely to the second millennium before the current era, we already find the Visvam Ekam, so the many who are one. Okay, in the Rig Veda, and in Buddhism, in early Buddhism, actually early Hinduism, in general. So we find also that death is both one and many. So there is an entire discussion about death as one and many, and this discussion actually is dated to the 7th or 6th century before the Common Era, but also relatively early. And so in the Vedic traditions, we already find a lot of thought about, but still very relatively simple, but discussion about this connection between the one and the many. We also see this if the viewers are probably familiar with the wheel of chakra, the Dharma wheel. So you see the wheel with all of these different lines connecting the hub with the wheel itself, and so this is the one in Vedic thought. This connects the one and the multiple.
You're talking about
that's exactly right. Yeah, that's the one.
One of the this one.
That's right. That's the one. Yeah, exactly. So that connects the one, and from the hub to the circle, that connects the one and the multiple in Vedic in Vedic thought.
Wow.
So that's that is something that you see relatively early on, and they write about this. They write about the one and the many, and this connection between these two concepts. But relatively simple, simpler than what we will see in Zoroastrianism, in the earliest layers of the Zoroastrian text, already in the Gathas. So the earliest layers, which are also 2nd century before the Common Era. By the way, a question that I often get is, how do we know that it is 2nd century before the Common Era? How do you're much, people say, well, you're much more skeptical about the Bible, dating the Bible, and here you're dating it to the 2nd century. The reason for that we can date the Gathas to somewhere in the second half of the at the latest, somewhere in the second half of the second millennium, is because they still use certain phonetic phenomena that ceased to exist across all Indo-European languages at that time.
Oh, wow. So you have an extinct fossil.
Yeah,
that
exactly.
is okay.
It's still in the Gathas. And so because it is unlike the Bible, this is written in rhyme and meter, okay, in a certain meter, we can tell what the phonetic structure was. Okay, otherwise it does not correspond to the meter. And so, thanks to the fact that it is written in this certain very, very strict manner, we can tell that they used phonetic structures in the Gathas, again, not everywhere, but in this early layer of the Avesta, that they use phonetic structures that ceased to exist in the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era across all Indo-European languages.
And just so everybody knows, and correct me if I'm wrong here, we have sources of the Gatha, but they're later. But your point is that the language itself is the evidence that shows that it is anchored back here. You said 2nd millennium BCE?
Correct, yeah.
Wow, so it's
millennium.
Over 4,000, or roughly 3,000 to 4,000 years old, easily.
About 3,500 years old, give or take.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Now you're right. They were not written down until much later, say millennia later, but because they were, these were orally transmitted, so they were, people knew how to recite them. Again, these are hymns recited in rhyme and meter. And so people were able to, basically, they had a kind of a recording device in their mind, and they would just learn how to recite them, and and from generation to generation, they would just repeat them, even if they didn't necessarily understand them, even if the certain phonological elements ceased to exist in the language that they actually speak. But they would be able to recite them from memory because they learned it from generation to generation. They were written down later on, but these phenomena ceased to exist as a spoken language around that time. So we can date the Gathas, generally speaking, pretty well to the around, give or take, middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era. So these are pretty old texts.
Right.
Okay.
And I just wish Joe Rogan would hear what you just said and then walk away and go, it must be a miracle, word for word. Kidding. Because this isn't what my point is that I've done some critical videos recently to apologists and stuff. and they claim, well, look, the Masoretic is 1,000 years later, and we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's a miracle, and it's word for word, which it isn't, but it isn't. But this idea, again, how come this isn't just as miraculous in a lot of people's minds? Because I find it fascinating that humans can carry on a tradition like that, including the Masoretic, scribes that come later. I'd say the same thing about this one.
But here's the thing. In the Homeric corpus and in the Avestan corpus, you're talking about hymns that have a rhyme and a meter. Very easy. That makes it easier to transmit.
Right.
Okay, it has to correspond. The Bible does not have rhyme and meters. It does not. It's a much freer text. It clearly was not orally transmitted. Because in order to, you'll see anything that is orally transmitted it has a rhyme and a meter to it. That's how because you sing it, you repeat it, you have to, it is engraved in your mind because it has a certain rhythm to it, right? It has a certain, much easier to exactly. But the Bible is a free text. It's not so clear. It is pretty clear that the Bible, or at least most of the Bible, of course, the Psalms and certain hymns that are in the Bible might have very well been orally transmitted, but that's a very small portion of the Bible. If we look at the Bible in general, it's not an orally transmitted text, and that is an important point. Often we say, well, we don't have a lot of one pushback that I get is that we don't have a lot of we have no evidence that the Bible was known before the 3rd century before the Common Era, but it was orally transmitted. Okay, so that you can't disprove this, right? Except that it doesn't look like an orally transmitted text, and we know how orally transmitted text, what they look like. They are hymns usually, and they have in order to be faithfully transmitted, they are written in a certain way. It's true of Homer, it's true of the Avestan text, etc., etc. So we know how orally transmitted texts are, what they look like, and again, the Bible is simply 90% of the Bible is simply not that, and so that's just an important point as well.
Thank you.
Sure. So once we get to the Gathas, again, we are still in the 2nd century before the Common Era. We see a development of this concept of essentiality. And so, for example, we see something that we will later, that will be familiar to anyone who's familiar with the Bible, in the Yasna, so in the sacred text of Zoroastrianism, the chapter 31 of the Yasna, which I return to often in my articles, because it's such an important section of the Yasna. We read, through your spentamainu, and I'll explain what that is. O Mazda, you created the world. Okay, so there is this other being, other essence, right? Through which, and it's uncreated. It's an uncreated essence, obviously, right?
This is the logos.
Exactly, and it's second millennium before the Common Era.
Golly, they're the OGs. I mean, this is where we need to be looking. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, this is 2nd millennium before the Common Era, and the spentamainu, O Mazda, you created the world. Again, now the spentamainu, by definition, because it is what Ahura Mazda used in order to create. So by definition, it is not created, right? That's what caused creation. And so it is an uncreated emanation, the spentamainu, which is really the life-giving thought, the spentamainu. That's the best way to think about it, the thought of Ahura Mazda, the logos. That's exactly the logos. The life-giving thought of Ahura Mazda, an uncreated emanation of Ahura Mazda, again, 2nd millennium before the Common Era. And it acts as a creative agency of Ahura Mazda, which is, and the best way to think of to understand the name Ahura Mazda is the Lord of thought setting, of how to think correctly, okay? And it is not a separate divinity from Ahura Mazda, but it functions as Ahura Mazda's creative power. Okay, So it's an emanation of Ahura Mazda. Now we will, of course, anyone familiar with the Logos, of course, it will be a central concept in Christianity later on. It is also the way that the Targums or some of the Targums translate Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, through wisdom, Yahweh created. So I don't know if you're familiar with this, but in the Targums, they add this through wisdom. That's exactly through the Spentamainu. Okay. And that's 2nd century, 3rd century of the Common Era. Okay. We still see this exact same concept reappearing, which appeared for the first time in the 2nd millennium before the Common Era in the Gathas. Okay.
Right.
So truly, and this is already taking these concepts, these Vedic concepts that we saw earlier. It takes them now to another level of philosophical engagement. In Yasna 44, which is a very important chapter in the Yasna that we find echoed in Isaiah, and we'll talk about Isaiah later on. But Yasna 44, we see this text. This I ask you, tell me truly, Ahura, who created together with dominion, okay, so with the power, the precious right-mindedness, so the way of thinking correctly, who by wisdom the Son obedient to the Father, who created the Son obedient to the Father. If you remember in 2nd Isaiah, there's an entire section of interrogation. Who created light? Who created darkness? Who created, all of that stuff? This echoes Yasna 44, a series of questions to the deity.
Interesting.
And I strive to recognize you by these things, O Mazda, creator of all things, again, through the Spentamainu. So again, in the Yasna, an echo that we will find again in Isaiah, in 2nd Isaiah. Now, Ahura Mazda, again, in the concept that we will see later on in Judaism and Christianity, is seen as the father, the ptah, of his emanations, of Asha, the truth and order, of Vohumanya, of good thought, of the Spentamainu, which we talked about, of Armaiti, of right-mindedness, which is considered his daughter. So all of these emanations that are dependent on him, they are not separate deities. Okay, they are emanations from Ahura Mazda. So this essentiality, this additional step in developing the concept of an essence, a divine essence, now is really kicking into overdrive.
Yeah,
it started. We've seen the seeds of it already in the Vedic tradition, but now in the Zoroastrian tradition, and relatively early in the Zoroastrian tradition, we see this developing further and much more complex. But these exact same concept we are going to see later on, of course, in Christianity and Judaism,
right,
as well, and in related Gnosticism, so-called Gnosticism, and things like that. So we will see this across the board in the late first millennium before and in the early first millennium after the Common Era. So, I mean, the impact of these Gathas is truly incredible, and we don't find this in other ancient religions. I'm sorry. That is really we don't find it in Egyptian religion. We don't find it in Mesopotamian religions. We really don't find it in antiquity, except for the Indo-Iranian. So that connection between the Vedic and the Avestan, we simply don't find it anywhere else. And it was, the connection, the historic connection of how this concept could have reached the West, the Greeks, and then the Bible, and etc., has to be through the Persian Empire.
That's what I was asking.
This concept.
Yeah.
That brought this concept to the Greeks and to everyone that was under its rule.
So if I may just hone in, that was what my question was going to be, is like, then, okay, how, right? How did this happen? And before we hit record, I just brought up a question in my mind because I kind of foresaw us getting somewhere into this. I had no clue some of the details. Fascinating descriptions of what was going on. But then how do you get from this to Bible, Judaism, Christianity? Because Judaism, we hear all the time, 2 powers in heaven. We hear this idea. We hear in Christianity, there are 3 powers in heaven. And then, you get some Gnostic texts that say there's 30. I mean, I kid you not, right? There's all these emanations.
Right.
So the question I have is, to be very precise, is how do you think that happened? Because when I read the pre-Socratics, me and Neil, Gnostic at Format, we dive into these Greek thinkers and we're like, damn, sure, they're getting deep. They're trying to figure out the world to make sense of it. But they're also, a lot of them are going into the one, right? There's just behind it all, there's one. Xenophanes, the famous quote, if donkeys could draw images of their gods or dogs, they'd look like donkeys or dogs. But his whole point was that all the gods that you see that are on the earth are all man-made, that there's really ultimately one real entity, and it doesn't have passions, and it doesn't have all these things that humans have, that we're fickle, we're not perfect, etc. So Greeks, we think of, came up with these ideas, but no, Greeks are also inheriting this from Persia and getting a lot of these ideas and incorporating them into their thinking. So maybe they put their stamp of synthesizing, but they got a lot of these ideas out of the Persian Empire. Is that the order you would put it in? Is that the Persians likely influenced Greeks and Greeks influenced Jewish people? Or would we say, no, the Jews were also under the Persian Empire and they're directly getting it from the source themselves as well?
Yeah, I think it's multidimensional. I think, clearly the empire influenced all the ethnicities and all the people groups under its influence. Clearly, and that is very unique to the Persian Empire, the first superpower in the world. It wasn't just an empire from an administrative perspective, but also from an ideological perspective as well. And it's for the imperial inscriptions, if you can compare the Achaemenid imperial inscriptions to Assyrian imperial inscriptions or to Egyptian imperial inscriptions and things like that, it's a completely different world. It is a completely different world. And it is deeply theological. 75% of the imperial inscriptions, again, this is not literature in the way we think of. It is literature, but it's not the way we usually think of literature. It's not. Most of them are not a story as such. But 75% of these imperial inscriptions basically say, "I, in the name of the king, the great king, etc. By the grace of Ahura Mazda, did X, Y, Z, and Ahura Mazda blessed me." All of that. They have usually a very clear structure, but 75 of them begin with a very short account of creation. So Ahura Mazda, who created the sky, who created the earth, the sky out there, and who created man, who created happiness for man, and who created the king to do X, Y, Z. So, but they begin, most of them, 75%, begin with an account of creation. So they are deeply theological. Okay, and very central. I mean, they center, most of them, the vast majority of them center on Ahura Mazda as the main deity, and really the only chief deity that the empire recognizes.
You got me wanting to do a video on this topic, like actually do a polished version of this, because the wheels are spinning in my head, honestly.
Fantastic. Yeah. No, this is why this is so important. It really is very important for us to understand how this developed. And again, we have this tendency, looking from our time today, where monotheism is much more developed, to go and project back to antiquity and to name certain things monotheistic, which should not be. We talked about 2nd Isaiah. I think you have 2nd Isaiah 45, excuse me. And usually I have people, when I say that there is no monotheism in the Bible at all, the pushback that I get is that, well, second Isaiah is monotheistic. I don't know if you can put
yes,
45 on the screen.
Absolutely.
So from verse 14. So yeah, there is no other God. You see at the end of this, right? There is no other God, only, yeah, exactly. And you'll see this returning again and again. So if you scroll down, no other God, and
I am God.
Exactly. There is no other. Yeah. So this repeats again and again throughout Isaiah 45. And
no God.
Exactly. So how can you say that this is not monotheistic?
Yeah. How can you say that?
Yeah, it's clearly monotheistic. But read the first verse of chapter 46.
Bel is bowed, Nebo is cowering. Their images
are so clearly Bel and Nabu exist, right?
Right.
So, and again, I'm not saying that necessarily these chapter 45 and 46 were written by the same person or written at the same time, but the person who put them together, the redactor,
right?
So no problem putting them together and saying, oh well, this should be second Isaiah and this should be monotheistic. How can I now start talking about Bel and Nabu?
Right.
Clearly, Bel and Nabu exist for whomever put this together or wrote this. And so this is clearly not monotheistic. Right. That's the definition. So this chapter that usually, I get as the proof text that there is monotheism in the Bible, just flip the page, right? Just flip the page to chapter 46 and you'll see that it's not, right? And that's truly that's very important.
Very, very important. Yeah, that's interesting because I mean, if there are any other gods that exist at all, that's problematic. A lot of the people I've spoken to will argue that the other powers, angels existing, demons existing, any other powers that are like divinity type entities, the categories from polytheism kind of try to give more power to the upper echelon of the pantheon or whatever the particular system you're in, and then the others get demoted. So angels replace gods, right? We see in the Dead Sea Scrolls that there's a text specifically Deuteronomy 32 that describes like the gods, plural, but then it becomes angelos, and the Greek translation wants to make them angels. It's
but this is weird to to some of us today. But if you look at outside the Bible, you look at the text from Elephantine that we talked about a lot, and you look at what people were actually writing in real time in antiquity, that wasn't even a question. There were clearly gods, plural. In Elephantine, that is very common. May the gods bless you. Even the so-called Passover letter, which was written as a to talk about a Yahwistic / Jewish observance, and was certainly related to some kind of observance to be observed by the Jews or by the Yahwists, begins with a invocation of the gods, plural, and we see it everywhere. Really, we see it in antiquity, really everywhere. That's not even a question. And as I said, even whenever Act 17 was written, even there you actually, that's the so-called Passover letter, and as you know, I read it differently.
Yep.
And those interested in my book that you mentioned earlier, I have an article there that shows why this is not related to the Passover. But exactly, that's the one. So
it's free to download. So,
yep,
go ahead.
It is free to download. It's very important for these for research to be freely accessible. And so and so even this letter, which is relatively late in the life of this community, in the end of the 5th century before the Common Era, even that one has blessing by the gods, by the many gods. And so, but again, even as I said, whenever chapter 17 of the book of Acts was written, which is maybe 2nd century of the Common Era, the words that were put in Paul's mouth basically also say, this God that you have been worshiping, I have come to declare to you. So this is a very polytheistic. This is not even essentiality. This is classic polytheistic thought of saying, you call this deity X, I call this deity Y. It's the same God. It's not even the essence.
Isn't it important also that people understand, like you're talking about to the unknown God, right? He sees a statue to an unknown God. This is what they would frame as
an altar. It's an altar. It's not even a statue.
Okay, so there's an altar to an unknown God, right? Yeah. And he's describing this God, obviously, as the creator of all things. Then he goes on, just taking it a step further to what your point was. Then he goes on and quotes, as your own poets, he says...
well, do you know who he's quoting? Do you know anything about the background here, by the way? It's very
Epimenides and a few other...
Epimenides.
Yeah.
But do you know what this altar is? The altar to the unknown God?
To Zeus, is it not?
No. So what according to Epimenides, not according to the story of Epimenides, which is mentioned later on in the Church Fathers, we don't have anything from Epimenides, of course, remaining. So according to that, what happened was that there was a huge plague in Athens at the time, and Epimenides was this Cretan kind of demigod, or not demigod, but a like a prophet or a very powerful.
He's the sleeping prophet, right? Had 56 years in a cave. He fell asleep or something like that.
Something like that. And so he was. The Athenians invited him to Athens to deal with the plague. And what he told them is build altars and dedicate them to the unknown God, and let your flocks of sheep go roam free, and wherever they sit, they assemble and just sit down and assemble your flocks. Wherever they just choose to come together and lay down, that is where you should put the altar. Okay, you should put the altar at that place. So basically, let your flocks dictate where you should place these altars. And according to the myth, of course, this dedication of an altar to the unknown God was what cured the city. And so so it's very interesting. The whole idea of Epimenides, and even the whole idea of Paul, or again, whomever writing this entire passage around several references to Epimenides, I find absolutely fascinating. In any event, but the trope that is being used there, again, 2nd century within a Christian context, definitely, is classic polytheism. Clearly working alongside also people thinking in terms of logos at that time, in terms of essentiality at that time, right? And so people were these things are not mutually exclusive, as I said. So essentiality and interpretatio are not mutually exclusive. Okay, they continue to live side by side, and the idea of all is one also exists side by side with these concepts as well. Now, if you look at other things, so for example, in the Bible, like the Shema Israel, right, the Shema prayer in the book of Deuteronomy. So hear, O Israel, right? Yahweh is our God, Yahweh is one. So again, people say, well, how can you say this is not polytheistic? Well, again, this is like saying I have one wife. Doesn't mean that there aren't any other women, but there is one. Okay. So it doesn't. So this is also not monotheistic in its in its definition.
Wouldn't the Ten Commandments also betray the idea? Because he's like, don't have any other gods.
Exactly.
Clearly, there are other gods, according to the scribe who wrote.
Well, actually, literally, what it says is for you there will be no other gods.
Right.
So, I mean, it's for you. Doesn't mean that there aren't any, but for you there won't be any others, right? Which corresponds to what we've seen. So that's your ethnic God. That's your ethnic deity. Let it define you, but it's not monotheism. And again, monotheism was not even much of a concern at the time. Now, interestingly, I was reminded by talking about this, I have one wife. So today in biblical scholarship, there are certain scholars that suggest a new concept of inclusive monotheism. There's a book, and a good book that came out just now, maybe last week, about in German about inclusive monotheism. And the book itself, I think, is very valuable, and the research in it is certainly something that I recommend. I recommend reading. But the concept of inclusive monotheism does not make sense. And the author of this book, I'm not going to mention names, I met him in Brazil last year, and after my lecture, he asked me what I think of this concept of inclusive monotheism. And my response to that is, well, ask your wife what she thinks about inclusive monogamy. I mean, there is no inclusive monotheism. It's either monotheism or it's not.
Right.
Now, the need to go back and reverse engineer history and to project monotheism on what is clearly not a monotheistic structure in the Bible, I think does not serve our field as a as a discipline. We should look at the reality as it was and not try to impose on it something that's simply not there, like the idea of monotheism. Monotheism, and we kind of talked about this at the beginning, we need to define our terms. And it's difficult to define monotheism, but monotheism should be understood as strict monotheism, meaning there is nothing else. One is all, basically corresponding to the Islamic Tawheed, which again is a very late development. Before the Islamic Tawheed, monotheism as such wasn't really much of a concern, wasn't a topic of heated debate. It became more of a concern in Christianity during the time that they had to deal with the development of the doctrine of the Trinity, and that's how Islam came to it from trying to negate this.
Right.
But monotheism as such was not. So even think about the Nicene Creed, right? So how it begins with pistevo is enan theon. So I believe in one God, right? Doesn't mean that there aren't others, but I believe in one. Again, like saying I am married to one woman. It's exactly the same. Doesn't mean that so the Nicene Creed is not, even to us it might sound like a monotheistic creed. I believe in one God. But it's not. It is not. It was simply not even something a concept to defend at that time. Okay. Strict monotheism, I mean. Okay, strict monotheism was not a concept to defend at that time. It just says we have one. Okay, we have one. I believe in one, etc., and the way how it the way it continues later on. So the concept of strict monotheism took millennia to develop from the essential elements in, well, pardon the pun, in essentiality, which we see in mid-second millennium in the Vedic traditions, beginning only there. You don't find it again. You don't find it in Egyptian theology. You don't find it in Mesopotamian theology. You find it in Indo-Iranian theology, and especially developed in the Gothas. Developing from there to Greek and biblical theologies. Now, some of our listeners and people often ask me, well, what about Akhenaten in Egypt? Wasn't he a monotheist, right?
Yeah.
That's very common. Well, actually, if you study Akhenaten, he was not a monotheist. Aten was the exclusive deity of Amarna, of El Amarna, not of the entire kingdom. So he was the exclusive deity in Amarna. But for Akhenaten, his father, Amenhotep III, was also deified. And he shows, and even Akhenaten shows his father as a deified pharaoh, okay? And other deities as well outside of Amarna. But Amarna was dedicated to Aten, of course, to the sun god. So even Akhenaten, we can't really say, and the thing about Akhenaten is that because we found more and more about him over time, in the beginning of the 20th century, really already in the 19th century, the little we knew about Akhenaten, it sounded monotheistic, and people took that idea and ran with it, especially people from Jewish Christian backgrounds, and started saying, well, this is the first monotheist, and the hymn to the Aten, which even that hymn is not really monotheistic. But it's very reminiscent of certain biblical passages. So people started just running with it because they come from Jewish or Christian background and seeing the similarity and saying, well, this must be monotheistic. But the more we learned about Akhenaten from other sites in other places, like, Akhenaten's people used to hack off different deities, but not all of them, not always. So there was something, especially against Amun, going on at the time, which was hacked pretty systematically, but clearly not monotheistic in any way. Just not monotheistic under Akhenaten in any way, as we can tell today.
Right. If I may chime in just to get your thoughts on this, because sounds to me it's a category issue we have today that they didn't have, where it's like we call it monotheism, but then you find out, well, there are other gods and they're deifying people. So it's not what we think of. It's all anachronistic in our minds. And it's a bad term to use because it's this idea like one, and this is it. And that's all backwards. And it makes me think of even like when I was reading some of the Roman sources, Greek and Roman sources, specifically under the Roman Empire, there was a time in the first or late 2nd century BCE, but I think it might have been somewhere in the 1st century BCE, they literally stamped out the cult of Bacchus. And they describe, obviously they thought they were doing all sorts of horrific things, but one of the key things that the source said is that they only worshipped Dionysus. Yeah. Now the thing is, they don't think there aren't any other gods. They exclusively decided they were going to focus on only worshiping Bacchus or Dionysus. Yeah. Father Liber, depends on the term. It's all synonymous, and probably different gods again, who they use the names synonymously, like you've been describing. So it makes me think that like no cult, even Akhenaten, like maps to this idea. Like there's always nuance. Like even Marduk, right? He's the chief deity, the most supreme. Yet there are other ones underneath it. And some of these cults might say, hey, we worship this one. Maybe a few others get a little bit of prayers from us or whatever, but they're primary deities. And it's not black and white. It's very scaled and nuanced depending on the culture. Absolutely.
And again, monotheism was simply not much of a concern in antiquity until Islam. So it's not, and again, Islam from the, much of Islamic theology is built on a reaction to the Christian debates. Okay, the debates about understanding the Godhead and understanding what the one and multiple in the Trinity, which was very, very developed. I mean, the whole approach by the church fathers, by the early Christians on how to approach the question of the Trinity was based on many centuries or millennia even of thinking about this one and many, which we saw already in the Vedic tradition in the second millennium before the Common Era. So all of that eventually led to building an entire theology around a Trinity. Okay, now the Trinity is not a triad. We have a lot of triads, and triads are just three gods. But the Trinity is 3 in 1 and 1 in 3, and that, and to be able to conceive of that, you need to take the concept that we saw in the Vedic tradition of the one, and of course in the Gathas, of the one and the many at the same time.
Right.
Okay. And so that's like the Spentamainu, right? The Spentamainu, which is from coming out of Ahura Mazda, which is the power by which Ahura Mazda created the world. Again, second millennium before the Common Era, but very similar to the way that the Holy Spirit is presented in the Christian theology, right? And so we see these concepts being recycled again and again and again over millennia. But monotheism as such, defining what is strict monotheism, one is all, only came later on from a position of negating the Christian position in many ways. Okay.
Yeah, I interviewed a few scholars about the debates that led up to, and some of them have different takes, of course, how they try to imagine reconstructing it. But one of the big debates that we saw was there were Christians themselves who were negating other Christians that were saying God didn't die. Deicide was a real strong debate for centuries. Sure. Because if Christ is God, as Christians portray him in the flesh, one with the many and the many with the one, right? It's all one, right. Though. They don't like that dirty word called polytheism. They don't like to say it's really three gods. No, it's one God, and we don't want to straw man them, but like you could see where it comes from. And the problem is, did God die? Because you're saying he's God. And so if he's part of that one, how do you detach him? And this was a serious debate Christians had with other Christians leading up to this period. And of course, yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. And they would, kill each other on these questions. I mean, people died for this. When you think about it today, it's really, people died for these questions and these debates. These were very, very, very serious debates. And of course, the region where Islam evolved initially was very much dominated by the Church of the East, which was considered heretical by the European Church, so to speak, or the Church of the West. And so that area where Islam was developed was very, very exposed to these debates and to people actually paying with their lives for these debates.
Right.
And so that in turn led to people outside Christianity start saying, okay, there is something here. Mm-hmm. There is a certain form of monotheism that is developed, that should be developed now. And that gave way to the Tawhid. So we see here a development starting somewhere in the beginning, in the middle of the second millennium before the Common Era, and reaching its climax with the advent of Islam.
Before we get to super chats, because we've got quite a few questions, and I thank you for everyone who's asking questions, throwing super chats. You literally are the reason we're able to even do this, and I just want to thank you, because without you, we would not be able to have a program like this. I wanted to take a look at some of these things before we moved out of here, because you sent me this beautiful picture.
Right.
What is this?
So this is the god of death, Yama. I forget what the Yama something. I forget the name. Let me double check here. Yamantaka, and this is the deity, the Vedic deity, on which it says, and just reading here from the Satapatha Brahmana, again 7th century, 6th century before the Common Era. As to this, they say, one death or many. So is there one death or many death? Let him say both one and many. So you see here already also this development of the one death here is talking about, is this one deity? Okay, because this is the deity called death. And it's one and many at the same time.
Wild. Yeah, the many faces, the many hands, the many arms, many legs.
Right. One and many, exactly.
That is wild. Okay, that's awesome. Now, we didn't get into this either, though.
Yeah, I mentioned the letter of Aristeas in passing.
Okay.
That is where the author of this letter writes to the king, to Ptolemy, in saying that what the Jews call Yahweh, we call Zeus.
Gotcha.
Okay.
So just giving
And this
people.
is dated to the 2nd century before the Common Era. So you see, later than what we would think the Bible was written, right? The letter of Aristeas, relatively late. And again, also using this exact same polytheistic concept of what you call X, we call Y. Again, the same thing that is used later on in the Book of Acts.
Just to
So
show
this
everybody.
continues.
Yeah. Here's your the degrees of assimilation, of course, all four. And
Right.
you got to go back and watch him break that down. I find that fascinating. So let me ask you one final question from me. And everybody who's hung out this long, thanks for your patience and all the support. What made you want to look at this? Like, what was there something you went and it just captured you and you realized, hold on, this is underexplored or underexplained? Was there something that happened? Did you eat a bad slice of pizza and say, hey, holy crap, I figured it out? Or what happened?
Well, I always like to be as precise as I can in the terminology that I use, and so when I use this, and I work a lot, as you know, on Elephantine and on early Yahwism, on Yahwism in general, and the development of Yahwism into Judaism, and we don't see any monotheism at all in Judaism / Yahwism in the Persian period and even later on, and so obviously digging into that reality that I'm studying, I have to define my terms, and I, started to kind of use these terms, make use of the term monotheism, and I would say, well, they are not monotheistic, et cetera, and I decided to just define what I mean by this, and to really explore as carefully as I can. This is still a work in progress. I mean, it's not. I'm not done yet. And I'm sharing with you and with the viewers this work as it is right now, and this is continuing. But yeah, from the study of Yahwism, I started to look at what am I actually talking about when I talk about monotheism / polytheism / endotheism / monolatry, and all of these different terms that are used, which I think all of them are problematic. Now, monotheism for me is only strict monotheism. There is no other. So it has to be something very similar to the Islamic Tawheed, and in other contexts, I use other. I usually use a compound sentence. I mean, I use a description. I don't use a word to describe it. So I say, for example, the head of the pantheon, or I say the ethnic deity, or things like that, right? But I don't use a term for this because I don't think that one term can encapsulate the historic reality.
I guess in piggybacking on that point to getting what made you catch this, were there other scholars before you who saw what you're talking about, the one and the many, and this concept in this couched within the tradition that we find in Persia, and its connections later into Judaism and Christianity, that you were inspired by?
That's a great question. Actually, well, so for a long time, people suggested that monotheism came from Persia, right? And that's because of Ahura Mazda, especially in the imperial inscriptions, and especially with Darius I, where it reads very, very monotheistic. It's all Ahura Mazda. Everything is Ahura Mazda, almost everything. So even for Darius, it's Ahura Mazda and the other gods who are, right? He says the other gods who exist, and he uses the verb to exist. That's also an innovation. So an eternal God that exists eternally, that's also an innovation, a Zoroastrian innovation or a Persian innovation. For example, in Egypt, you had an eternal deity as well, but it's not eternally existing, it's eternally procreating. Okay, that's a very different concept. It's eternally procreating itself. Okay, that's something very different from eternal existence, to be, the verb to be, right? The to be, to exist always, unchangeable, to just exist eternally. And so that you find in the Persian, in Darius the First and the Persian inscriptions. So people were looking at that and said, well, okay, monotheism came from that. But my question was, is this really monotheistic? And of course, even the Persians are not really monotheistic. Even again, you have Ahura Mazda and the other gods who are. And later on, well, that's another important point. When you say Ahura Mazda and the other gods who are, the correct way, I believe, and I wrote an article that dealt with this a little bit also, is the other gods who are is really a reference to the emanations of Ahura Mazda. These are not other deities, but really something that you can compare to angels, if you will. So these are like the Spentamainu and all of these other emanations from Ahura Mazda that come. So the other gods who are not other gods, but emanations of Ahura Mazda.
Right.
But still, they operate as divinities. Then they are divine. You have names and theophoric elements in names that are these divinities, not Ahura Mazda. Ahura Mazda is not, as such, not part of any theophoric name, Ahura Mazda. But you do have the emanations of Ahura Mazda being used in theophoric names, in personal names with a divine element in them. And so these are. So people thought that, okay, this is the beginning of monotheism, and it is in a way. I mean, it is an important step, a critical step, toward the development of eventually what would become another step in the development of essentiality, and what would become a step in all is one, but not one is all.
Right.
And eventually, with the rise of Islam, it would come to its peak. But then. So my interest was in tracing the development of this, also to understand the 15. But also, I am studying. Big part of my research is the Persian age of empires. So all three empires: the Achaemenid, the Parthian, and the Sasanian. And right now, I'm focusing actually on the end of the Sasanian Empire and the interface with Islam, with the rise of Islam, which is why I'm talking about the emergence of strict monotheism under early Islam.
Yeah, and the Christian group I was thinking of earlier was Nestorians, but there's so many different kinds. So yeah, this is awesome. This is awesome. I love learning from you, Gad. We love you here at Myth Vision. We love learning and hearing these ideas. I hope more people will go get your book. It's free. Download the book. Look out for your upcoming book that you have coming. We got some questions. I'm not going to keep people waiting any longer. I really appreciate their support. And thank you for becoming a member. We the People 8280. Really appreciate that. First question today. Solaranite, thanks for being a member and for super chatting. One God simply means one nation under God. Conquered tribes, nations, kindreds, and tongues under one flag or empire. Theocracy, imperialism.
Well, I mean, I would say no. That's these are two different categories. I mean, what one God means is that there is no reality outside that deity. Nothing exists outside. Okay, there is no other reality outside the deity. It is everything that is. Actually, let me look it up here. When I'm, let me see. So there is in Islam. So we talked about Islam as the Tawheed and what is the definition of monotheism in Islam. So the prayer of, or the proclamation of it's called the El-Ikhlas in Islam. It goes like this: say, He is Allah, who is one. Okay, say. So it's something that you have to say. Mm-hmm. Allah is one. Okay. Allah, the eternal refuge, or the absolute. He neither begets nor is born. So that again goes straight into the heart of Christian thought, and and not just Christian, but also the Zoroastrian thought.
Yeah.
That's the idea, because in Zoroastrianism, the emanations are sons and daughters of Ahura Mazda.
But they're eternally begotten, the same way you find, in a sense, right? It's like they're eternally, they're not like at some point begotten, but they
exist, correct.
Right.
That's right. Eternally exist.
Okay.
And he neither begets nor is born, nor is there in him any equivalent. There is nothing like him in him. So there is nothing at all, does not exist beyond this deity. That's everything in existence. Every atom, everything in existence is part of this, or contained within this idea of Allah. And in Islam, so this concept, very strong, very powerful, and later it came back into Judaism, for example, through Maimonides, who was, who lived under in a Muslim context, and some say actually converted to Islam. So so that came to Judaism through Maimonides. It came through to Christianity later on as well, through Islam, through the disputations between Muslims and Christians later on. But this concept was first really formulated here, and that means that there is just one God. So it does not to answer the question, it does not really touch upon how this is applied in a geopolitical sense, right? In how you conquer, or how you form an empire or a flag or anything like that.
Thank you so much, Solera. Appreciate that. Matthew in the house. Thanks, Matthew. Where do Christians go in these categories?
Again, that's a great question. And things like everything in religion, things evolve over time. Every religion evolves. Every religion is evolving today. That's what a lot of people miss. A lot of people think that religion is fossilized. It's never fossilized. Religion is always developing. And so it depends on what time, what period of Christianity you're talking about. And as I said, Christianity was also influenced by this development of the Tawheed in Islam, and also to now start dealing with, where do Christians stand before this concept of strict monotheism? Again, the Nicene Creed, for example, does not deal directly with that question, or even the church fathers at that time did not deal with this. They dealt with the concept of one and many, okay, but not with absolute strict monotheism. And so, where do Christians go in this category? Again, depends on the period, but generally speaking, there is no strict doctrine of monotheism in Christianity as such. So, it's not a pillar. Christians say that they are monotheistic. Jews as well, also, and even in Judaism, you have Kabbalah, which is really not monotheistic. You have the 10 spheres in Kabbalah, and the tree of the spheres in Kabbalah, where the Spirit of God, or the Shekhinah, goes up and down the tree, and you have basically 10 deities in that concept. I know a lot of people would disagree with me, but that's when you actually read the text. That's the way they are presented through the simple reading of the text.
Just to show people, it's a bad example here. You could kind of get it with the body too. I see this stuff in a lot of like New Age stuff too. You could see a lot of that's just borrowing from a lot of Kabbalistic. There's different kinds. It's hard to see.
If you read the foundational text of Kabbalah, which is the book of Zohar, in that book, it actually describes each one of these as a unit in its own right, as a really in many ways as a deity in its own right, and the Shekhinah is a goddess that actually, and the Zohar goes into a lot of detail on how she copulates with Yahweh, with the God. And so it is in many ways it can be read. It would have been read by someone in antiquity as a polytheistic text.
Yeah, and just to add to what Matthew's question is, when you deal with Neoplatonism, because you go from Middle Platonism and Neoplatonism, and the Neoplatonists are doing all sorts of stuff, playing with these exact categories you're discussing. Some go so far that there are Gnostic texts that say there are 30 divinities, or I can't remember exactly how many, but there's like a ton. And you go, how? We scratch our heads because we've been born in a time where these debates have been so ironed out and hammered out, and like we have ideas of one God and we're believers in one God. And then, Christians and Muslims online are debating more than ever today through the internet over, no, you believe in three gods. No, we believe in one and it's just three. And it's like, and that never ends. It's going to keep going forever, probably.
That's right.
But this idea is like we scratch our heads realizing there were Christians who identified as followers of Jesus Christ who believed there were 30 deities, 30 gods. What? So that's because we come at it with all the baggage and don't realize very early on there were a lot of different ideas that came out of the movement. So right. I think that's important. Thank you, Matthew. Bakken, thank you so much for being a member and for the Patreon, the super chat. What Persian influence is there on Enoch? Good question. Does Enoch mirror Persian mythology? Was apocalyptic literature mirror Persian mythology? Great question.
Great question. There is so for the period that we're talking about, my answer would be there is not direct influence there. Of course, there is apocalyptic. There are apocalyptic elements to Persian thought and to Zoroastrian thought, but later on, in later period, and some have argued that that's actually an influence back on Zoroastrianism from Jewish/Christian writings as well. So we do find elements that we see in Enoch and in apocalyptic literature in Zoroastrianism, but for each case and each example, the question is who influenced whom. And in Parthian, but especially in Sasanian times, in the areas that the Persian Empire, the Sasanian Empire ruled, especially in Mesopotamia, in what is today Iraq, you had a very large, very influential Jewish community and, of course, Christian community. And there was a lot of dialogue between the Sasanians, the Zoroastrians, and the Jews and the Christians. A lot of back and forth, a lot of cross-pollination. And so we need to be very, very careful. I have heard people say, well, there is clearly influence of Zoroastrians for these late concepts. There is clear evidence, clear influence from Zoroastrians on certain Jewish texts and Christian texts. I advise to be I try to be very cautious with this. And when I talk about influences, so for example, when I talk about Achaemenid influences on the Bible, which I've published quite a bit on, I always limit myself to what I can prove did actually exist in Achaemenid times. Okay. So I this is, one needs to be very, very cautious on this, especially with these later elements or later characteristic ideas, and to know where the influence flows.
Right. Yeah. Again, I think that's a fascinating question worth looking deeper into, because I see not only Mesopotamian influence with Adapa. I think Seth L. Sanders did a really good job of showing like this tradition, and then Greek stuff too, occasionally, that you find in there. Bakken, thank you so much for that super chat again. Doesn't Islam believe in angels? So that brings up this category issue, right? In my mind, like, how do they? Clearly, we see angelos, as divinities that evolve into angels. That, how do Muslims have angels and not be somehow not monotheist? You see what I'm saying? How are there other powers?
That's an excellent question. So yeah, they do have angels, and angels are in that sense very much like an emanation. So the angels don't have any existence without the deity. They don't exist without the deity. They depend on the deity, and they are sent by the deity. They do the will of the deity. So they are more than a prophet in many ways, in a sense, because they don't die, right? But they are much less than a deity. The difference between how Islam thinks of angels and early Judaism or even or Zoroastrianism thinks of the emanations, is that in Islam they have this definition of a strict monotheism. And this is one of the pillars. The Tawheed is one of the pillars of Islam. And everything else, the way you understand angels has to be subservient to the way you understand the one God.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have that in other ancient deities, ancient religions. So because you have that definition, you have to understand now angels as being not corresponding to the definition of this one God. Again, the absolute, eternal, not begetting, not begotten, etc., etc. And so, yeah, the angels have the power to do divine things on behalf of the deity, or to do things on behalf of the deity, but they're not other deities. They're not God.
So another way of putting it is just they have in their minds found a way to make sure that category doesn't dabble with the divinity itself in any way.
Right.
So it's such an important category that they've theologized it in their mind to make sure that you understand they are saying there is only one God.
Absolutely. I think the Tawheed, the Islamic Tawheed, is one of the most impressive philosophical leaps in humanity. I mean, again, for millennia, no one has tried to define this as a principle, a pillar of any religion. Okay, there was this strict monotheism it was not a thing as such in any religion. Okay, it was not a pillar of any religion. Strict monotheism, absolute monotheism. You had the heads of pantheon. You had ethnic deities. You had, I have one God. Okay, it doesn't mean that there aren't others, but for me there is one.
Right.
You had things like that, but you never had anything like this absolute definition. And so, in many ways, this Tawheed is truly one of the impressive philosophical and very, very succinctly defined leaps that any religion has done.
Thank you so much, Bakken, and thank you for that answer. Shishkabade, thank you so much for the super chat. I appreciate it. Hanukkah seems clear evidence to me that Second Temple Judaism was strongly influenced by fire-worshipping Zoroastrians, especially for Second Maccabees.
Well, I've written a lot about this, about fire worship and Zoroastrianism in Judaism. Hanukkah is a good example, but there are better examples. The eternal fire, the concept of the eternal fire in the temple. In the book that we've talked about, this Yahwism under the Achaemenid Empire, in that book, there is a very good article by a colleague of mine, Itamar Kislev, on the eternal fire as an Achaemenid influence on the Bible, especially on Leviticus and Numbers. So he shows exactly, very systematically how this process developed. I have an article that came out a few months ago that analyzes the pericope of the burning bush in the book of Exodus. In this case, this is very, very detailed Zoroastrian influence on that particular scene. So, and Hanukkah is much later, of course. But yeah, there's a lot of now. What's interesting is that now, if we go to history, not the Bible, but actual history, we have in Elephantine, we have documented in the Yahwistic temple / Jewish temple, if you prefer, at this the temple of this Jewish / Yahwistic community at Elephantine, 5th century before the Common Era, we have a fire altar or a fire holder in the temple to Yahweh on that island. Okay, we have that documented from primary source at the time, real time. So we know that at least in that temple at Elephantine, there was an actual fire holder, and they use, again, in this primary source, they use the term Atarodan, which is the Zoroastrian / Avestan / Persian, because it's a mix of Persian and Avestan term for the fire altar. I don't like to use the term fire altar because it's not an altar. Nothing is really being offered on it. It's a fire holder. It's used for veneration of fire. It's a divine fire. And so we know that within the temple, so within this Jewish temple, there was a fire holder at Elephantine. I claim that this was probably almost certainly the case also in Jerusalem, because we see this same idea of an eternal fire in the Bible. Okay, we see this perpetual fire, this fire that cannot go out, that has to be divine, has to come from a divine source. If you offer a non-divine fire, you die, right? That's Nadab and Abihu, that the sons of Aaron. So the fire has to come from God, right? And so it has to be, it cannot go out. It's a perpetual fire. So probably there was also something like that in Jerusalem that gave the authors of this the concept of perpetual fire within Judaism, that their inspiration.
Just to show people just an example of something that it could possibly look like. But you also did a video with me, shameless plug, if you haven't watched that interview, covering your point about the burning bush. And what stood out to me, obviously the language you're reading, you see things I can't because I'm not able to read those languages. But when you have a worshiper standing in front of the actual altar in a Zoroastrian context and his shoes are off, and you have the story of Moses in front of a burning, everlasting fire that is supposed to be the deity, in a sense, saying to him, take off your sandals, you're on holy ground. That there was so much. I hope people will go check out that interview. That was such a fascinating one. That forces you to have to look at the Persian stuff. I love it. I love it. Thank you. Bakken, again, thank you. What about the Essenes? Were they polytheistic? If the Essenes became the Nestorians who taught Islam, isn't this a consistent stream of thought?
Yeah, we know practically nothing about the Essenes as such. We only have a few descriptions of the Essenes in different, very remote sources that some of which were never in the area at all. So we know very little about the Essenes. It's really hard to know, but there is so even if one is not strict monotheist, it doesn't mean that they are polytheistic as such. Okay, so that's also not only the term monotheistic is problematic, but also the term polytheistic is problematic as well. Now, as I said, the certain concepts that are central to polytheism continue to persist well into the Common Era. Again, going back to we talked about the Book of Acts, even, right? So certain very polytheistic or so-called polytheistic. Again, I always pause because that's the definition of the term polytheistic is problematic. But yeah, certain elements are continue, and for people living at the time, they were not mutually exclusive. Again, strict monotheism was not even a concern yet. And when the Essenes were flourishing, however they were and wherever they were, when they were an active sect, there was no contradiction between what this idea of you call the deity X, I call it Y, and the essentiality of the divinity. They were not mutually exclusive. So it's really hard to it's really hard to know. They were not polytheistic, certainly not polytheistic in the classic sense. But so for what we know from Qumran, whether they were Essenes or not, that's another question. But what we know from the sect in Qumran, they certainly believed in angels. And the angels had a lot of authority. But Yahweh was the chief god, clearly the head of the pantheon, the head of the ethnic deity. So Yahweh was the chief deity. Doesn't mean that others did not exist. We still don't have a strict definition of monotheism at that point yet, but they had Yahweh as the chief deity.
And this is where we get this idea. That's why I asked the question about the angels earlier, because the idea that you can have an angel of the Lord, that's not, you're not going to find that in Islam. Okay. They're not going to allow an angel to be equivalent with Allah, right? Like, and in Judaism, or at least these scriptures seem to express ideas where God is present. I think, later scribes are doing a lot of this stuff, but they're
like the burning bush. I mean, the burning bush, that's one time, one verse, it's God speaking from the bush, and another it's the angel of God, right? So you have this equivalence between God and angel of God, which is also very Zoroastrian in that sense, because Ahura Mazda is seen as the father of the fire of Atar. So you have what is the God and what is being sent by the God. An angel, by definition, is what is being sent. It's the messenger.
Thank you, Bakken. Really appreciate it. They're flowing in here. Just bear with me, Gad. Mark Nagel, thank you so much for the super chat. In Zoroastrianism, are Ahura Mazda and Engramanu Ahriman two separate and equally powerful gods? Is Zoroastrianism monotheistic or dualistic?
Okay, great question. No, so Ahura Mazda in Zoroastrianism, Ahura Mazda. So Angra is below Ahura Mazda, and actually Angra and Spenta Mainyu are opposed, but not Ahura Mazda. In later stages, there are places where Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu are battling, so to speak, or are opposed. But in classic Zoroastrianism, this is not the case. And Ahura Mazda is above all of these different Mainyus. So that's the kind of the short answer is no. There is no equivalency. It's like, it's in that sense, it's like the Hebrew Bible with Satan. Satan is not at the same level as Yahweh.
Gotcha. And then the dualistic thing is there combat?
Dualism? Yeah. So there is, of course, dualism in Zoroastrianism very early on. It's also evolving, like everything. So you have different versions of dualism. But yes, you have this clear separation of good and bad, and different realities in the world belong to one or the other.
Thank you, Mark. Great question. Thank you so much. Eddie Moretti, good to see you. Thank you for the super chat. The Grandmaster Gad. Wow. Can Gad speak to how radical Jewish practices were to pagan rituals from 300 BCE? Does Gad essentially agree with Jan Assmann that the practice of Judaism was in effect a revolutionary provocation?
No, I don't think it was very. What was truly revolutionary about Judaism is not so much the cultic practice. What was revolutionary about Judaism, and that is very revolutionary, and it continues to impact our lives to this day, is the creation of an authoritative corpus, written corpus, that ultimately became kind of the manual by which you live your life. Now, I think we talked about this already in previous episodes on Alexandria and what happened there. As you may know, my research points to the Bible being composed under the influence of Alexandria, and what happened there is that Alexandria's innovation was the need to create an authoritative text, not an authoritative religious text necessarily, but authoritative text. And what the scholars in Alexandria did is they looked at different manuscripts and created authoritative texts for Homer, for Hesiod, for different Greek sources like that. The idea was to create an authoritative text. The Jews in Alexandria, or impacted by Alexandria, looked at that and adopted many or all, basically, of the techniques that were developed in order to create this authoritative text, and apply them to texts that they already had somewhere, but mostly created new texts. Well, I don't know if mostly, but also created new texts that ultimately together created the Bible. Okay, but what you had for the first time is applying the techniques and the concept of an authoritative text that was this big innovation of Alexandria to a cultic / religious context. And that, of course, gave birth to the Bible. And suddenly you have a book that is authoritative, that is also a manual of religion, of how you live your life. Okay? This is a very complex process. A lot of things go into this. I'm not going to go into all the details. But ultimately, you have a process that over many decades, probably about just a little over a century, grew to create this corpus that we now know as the Bible. Okay, so around the beginning of the 2nd century before the Common Era. And that event of having a religious authoritative text for the first time, no other religion had a religious authoritative text, applied the same techniques that the scholars of Alexandria applied for Homer and other other texts like that, to apply that now to a religious text. That was a huge innovation. And that innovation, eventually, of course, led to other sacred texts like the New Testament and a lot of texts that are, all the Gnostic literature and many other texts that came out of this, the pseudepigrapha and deuterocanonic text and all of these things. So you have this period was so energetic in producing texts. You see it. You can actually see it in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you can see you can feel the energy. At least I can, or maybe I'm imagining things, but I feel the energy that people put into creating authoritative text and working on them and making them, applying these techniques that were initially developed in Alexandria to these texts, and trying to create more and more authoritative texts, and hoping that this will be the version that will eventually become authoritative. Ultimately, the version that became authoritative because it was the version that was promulgated by the Hasmoneans. That's Jonathan Adler talks about this quite a bit. So, so that is what became the authoritative text.
Thank you.
That is truly what was revolutionary. There was nothing like this previously. And that, as I said, that impacts our lives up to this day for good and bad.
And Eddie just says, wow, I get it. The Alexandrian influence was revolutionary. Mind fully blown. Thank you, Eddie. Mine as well. Will Mose, thank you so much for the super chat. Is Gad saying one God in Islam the same as Atman Brahman in Advaita Vedanta? Then my favorite guest, they said.
Well, thank you. No, so that's these concepts are not one is all, but all is one. Okay, so that's exactly the difference here. Okay, this Hindu concept that you're referring to is all is one is no all is one. I get these mixed up sometimes, but
just to show people. Yeah,
I think I even mentioned this here. Yeah.
Yep. So maybe our super chat friend here may have missed this part of the video. I would recommend obviously going back and rewatching, because you develop this and you do point out this issue with Hinduism, all is one, and then later we end up getting the one is all.
And I actually mentioned the Adita in that.
You literally have mentioned the very thing that he was bringing up. So, Will, thank you for the super chat. I hope you check out earlier. Go rewind it. If you're watching this and you came in late, trust me, you want to rewind this. It's really, really fascinating what Gad has done. I got to pick up my brain particles off the floor and put them back in my head when we're done here. Bakken, again, thank you so much, Bakken, for the super chat. Cannabis played a huge role in holy oil and incense. Cannabis was in the Haoma, non-alcoholic, I believe. Did this play a role in Judaism?
Well, interesting question. So, no, the Haoma did not have any cannabis in it. Haoma is made from one ingredient. This is the Haoma plant. We don't know what it was at the time. We know what is being used for Haoma today in Zoroastrianism, but we don't know that it's necessarily the same that was used in the Achaemenid times. Many different theories, but certainly not cannabis. But that being said, we know that cannabis did play a huge role in many different religions, ancient religions. We see that across the Eastern Mediterranean into Mesopotamia and many different places. Even in Tel Arad, we found a altar. And they did some. They took, some elements, some substances that were found on the altar. They analyzed it and found that these were cannabis. So, in a Judean context, you clearly have on the altar you have cannabis, and so that did play. To answer your question, yes, cannabis certainly did play a role to a certain extent in Judaism.
Thank you,
but it's not related to the Haoma.
So, okay, you're just separating the two.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bakken. You rock. Mr. Anderson in the house. Deuteronomy 10, verse 17 states, Hashem is a God of gods. Ahura Mazda is the same. Shang Ti of ancient China is also the same. Even in Hinduism, some claim Brahman as a single essence that created other gods. Have you studied Shang Ti?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. Yeah, so Shang Di, yeah.
Shang Di. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm reading it later.
No, but he wrote Shang, or he or she, I don't know, wrote Shang Ti. That's fine. But anyway, so when I said studied, I read about it. I'm certainly not an expert in Chinese religion, but I do know that this concept did exist. Again, God of gods does not negate gods, right? He's a god of other gods. So that's not really certainly not a strict monotheistic view. I mean, it's exactly like the imperial rulers, all empires pretty much. The ruler of the empire characterized himself as the king of kings. So there are other kings,
right?
But he's the king of kings.
Yeah, the category exists, and there's others in it, but he's the chief.
That's right.
Got it. Mr. Anderson, you rock. If I mispronounced that, I apologize. Vijisa Fool, wow, thank you so much for the super chat. Yahweh is hope. Animals abused in this fallen world are redeemed in heaven. Those who abuse them will be in the lake of fire.
I have no comment on this.
Yeah, thank you so much for the super chat. I think it's a nice thing to say, hey, don't hurt animals. That's my takeaway on this. The most polite way of putting it. I don't think anyone should have a lake of fire. That's just my takeaway. Right. The punishment, does it fit the crime, But then also you send another super chat, and I really appreciate it. God is formless, no place. Like the laws of logic in your mind exist, but no place. Unless the persons manifest in space in form. To me, it's logical.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the support. And thank you. All right. Mr. Anderson is back again with Judaism and many other ancient religious writings attesting to a divine council-like theory. How many of these writings also attribute a spiritual enemy to a single spiritual entity? demanding that they alone be God.
Okay, so I'll need to.
That's a long one. Sorry.
Yeah, that's a long one. So can you? Yeah. So. Well, again, this is. So going back to the concept of a pantheon, which is really what we're talking about here. So these are other forces, and a god that demands that they alone be God. Clearly, there are other divine forces, and that the deity asks to be the only god of a certain context. So in antiquity, within Judaism, ancient Judaism, or within really any other context, you have the deity requires so in these contexts, the deity requires to be the only ethnic entity deity of this group of people. So it doesn't mean that there aren't any other gods, but exactly like we said with the Ten Commandments, for you there will be no other god before my face, translating it literally, al panai. So there will be no other gods for you. So in our pantheon, in our ethnic context, in our group context, in our tribe, there will be no other god. I alone am God, which is what the deity says.
And then, one of the things that, oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Just one of the things that came to mind with this, when you go read some of these passages, people like the Lucifer passages and other passages, a lot of this, I think this stems from a lot of the hubris that comes from some of the kings. Specifically, we had a Mesopotamian king from the 2nd millennium BCE who during his life claimed to be a divinity, and then crap hit the fan for the nation, and then they blamed him for his hubris, and then they had curse poems and stuff that they like propaganda against this guy for doing that. So part of me thinks some of these things we might find in the Bible that sound like there's an enemy or whatever is really just a human king, a Babylonian king with hubris. And, he's opposing the God of the ethnic God of Israel. And that's what I would say a lot of that might stem to. Couple more here, and then we'll wrap things up. Mr. Anderson's back again. Says, all is one and one is all, like the Three Musketeers motto. Is this the same as we are Myth Vision? Keep up the great work. Yes, it's one and many. That's why I do the plural, like the we are. We're all together here on this. So, yes, thank you, Mr. Anderson. Great observation. And then Bakken again, thank you for the final super chat. No more super chats after this. If you've already don't, I want to make sure that I don't lose my friend here, Gad, from saying I'm never going to get off that show if I don't. We want to have him back. So, how does Islam view Satan? Is Satan part of Allah?
No, Satan is certainly not part of Allah. Satan does exist as a tempter, as an evil force. I'm not certainly not an expert of Islam. Okay, I'm looking only at the development of monotheism within Islam, not other things. But from what I know about this, Satan is basically the force of evil. Certainly not part of Allah. And not undermining Allah in any way. This is something that the individual person needs to contend with, and this is part of even of jihad. I mean, jihad is mostly spiritual battle against the evil force, and so that's how Islam, from my understanding at least, views Satan.
Yeah, I just think they do something in their minds, like I was saying earlier, to demote or even like completely separate the God from.
Well, once you have that's the thing. Once you have the Tawheed, once you have the definition of strict monotheism, everything else falls into place. Or
got it.
More, is again, there is no absolute strict monotheism in actual reality.
Yeah.
no one can live in a world that there in no, where you don't have other powers.
Right.
That's just not. Again, like I said, monotheism is not natural. That's what I said at the beginning of our talk today. Monotheism is simply unnatural. Fascinating human development, the human psychological and philosophical development, absolutely fascinating, but completely artificial.
Yeah, I prefer polytheism. I'm not gonna lie. I think it's more fun to me. But then again, it's because I didn't grow up with it. Maybe I don't know. And I think that like that's my questions were kind of vestigial. Like it was kind of like you still have these like remnants of polytheism, but maybe they renegotiate where they go or where they belong in later Islam. But yeah, I hope everybody enjoyed this show as much as I did. I could tell you we covered degrees of assimilation. We went into Isaiah 45 to 46 to show you that the most monotheistic, scare quotes, monotheistic, is just so happens to not be. Just read the next verse in verse 1 in chapter 46. He brought up Aristeas. We brought up this Indo deity that is the death of many deaths in one death. And then we also have his book. I hope everybody takes the time to go download for free. The link is pinned in the comment section. You have a PDF form and an EPUB form. If you want to pay the $141 and get the hardcover, you can do that. And he just wants to make this scholarship freely accessible to anyone and everyone who has access to the internet, or maybe even needs an email. You can get this email to you and download it on your tablet or on your phone or whatever. Anything else you want to say before we wrap things up?
No, thank you. I really enjoyed this discussion. Enjoyed the super chats very, very much, and thank all the super chatters for their input very much. And thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Gad Barnea, the legend, the man, the polytheistic deity among the many gods that dwells among the scholarship in the world. I'm kidding. No,
certainly not that.
I will say this, if you don't mind me complimenting you on your appearance, you've done a hell of a job in taking good care of your health. And in fact, it's given me some inspiration to want to try and do that for myself. So the last time someone actually mentioned, did he shrink? Someone said you shrank in the comment section. Yes, he did.
Yes.
You've been doing really good. You look great. And I look forward to our next adventure together.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, like the video, share the video, comment your thoughts down below, and subscribe if you haven't already. Get his book. It's free. If you do those things, those are free ways to help. If you want to help us out in other ways, you can super chat. You can join the Patreon, buy a course from us. We have all of those ways you can help fund what we're trying to do to keep the lights on. Until next time, never forget, we are MythVision.
Son, do you want to know what the truth is? After this, there's no turning back. You take the blue pill and you wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to. You take the red pill and you stay in Wonderland, and I show you just how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.